The rain hadn't touched the 90th floor of the Meridian Tower in years. Up here, above the neon veins of Abyss City, the storm was just a smear of silver against glass, and the penthouse belonged to a man who owned more than he could ever count. Dante Corvain stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows with a crystal tumbler in his hand, laughing at something no one had said, when the first pain exploded inward. The sound came a half-second before the understanding. A sharp crack, then the glass wall simply ceased to exist. A curtain of glittering fragments blown into the room by the high wind and the round that had punched through it. Dante dropped instinctively, the tumbler shattering on marble, and to anyone watching, he looked exactly like what the tabloids swore he was. A soft, pampered heir folding at the first sign of danger. 3 men came through the ruined window on descent lines, black-clad, faces masked, rifles already shouldered. 2 more kicked open the private elevator doors on the far side of the suite. Professionals, not the sloppy street muscle the Obsidian Syndicate usually sent to rattle him. These moved like they'd rehearsed the layout, fanning across the open-plan living space, cutting off exits, herding. "Please," Dante gasped, scrambling backward on his palms until his broad shoulders hit the base of a marble column. He raised both enormous hands, and his voice cracked beautifully. "Please, I have money. I have so much money. Whatever you want, I'll triple it. Just don't shoot. Oh God, don't shoot." The lead gunman said nothing. He crossed the room in unhurried strides, boots crunching on broken crystal, and lifted his rifle until the muzzle hovered a foot from Dante's forehead. Behind the mask, a small, satisfied breath. This was the shot they'd been paid a fortune to take. The useless prince of the Corvan shipping empire, cornered and weeping on his own floor. Then the skylight came down. There was no warning, no telegraph sound of approach. One instant, the glass ceiling above them held the storm at bay, and the next, it detonated downward in a brilliant shower, and something dropped through the center of the room like a blade through silk. Harper hit the marble in a low crouch, one gloved hand flat against the floor, the other already bringing a suppressed pistol up along her sightline. She had crossed 40 feet of open air from the rooftop of the adjacent tower on a line no sane person would trust, and she landed like she'd merely stepped off a curb. The lead gunman turned. He was fast. He was not fast enough. Her first 2 rounds took him under the jaw before his muzzle finished its arc, and he folded without a cry. Harper was already moving, flowing sideways out of the space where she'd landed, because standing still was how amateurs died. Dante watched from the floor, and behind his mask of terror, something ancient and enormous stirred awake. She was extraordinary. The second and third shooters opened up, and the penthouse filled with the flat coughing of suppressed fire and the sharper crack of return rounds tearing into furniture. Harper didn't hide. She used the room the way a surgeon uses an instrument tray, knowing exactly where everything was. She rolled behind a low steel sculpture, came up on its far side, and put a round through the shoulder of the man reloading, spinning him, then a second through the base of his skull. She had already discarded him from her attention before his body reached the ground. Icy gray-green eyes swept the space in fractions of seconds, logging angles, counting muzzles, tracking the 2 by the elevator who were now advancing in a stack. 2 hostiles left, plus 1 wounded at her 3 o'clock still capable of fire. The principal was down and unhelpful, curled against a column making noises like a frightened seal. Wonderful. She'd taken the contract 11 hours ago, and she was already down a skylight and up several corpses. Harper broke cover. She did it because the elevator pair expected her to stay pinned. An expectation was a weapon you could turn on people. She came out low and fast on a diagonal that none of their barrels were tracking, closing the distance before their reflexes could catch up to the change. The first man got his rifle halfway around, and she was inside its length, one hand clamping the barrel and shoving it toward the ceiling as it discharged harmlessly into the dark, the other driving the butt of her pistol into his throat. He gagged. She pivoted him bodily into his partner, fired twice through the gap between their tangled arms, and both dropped in a heap of limbs and matte black gear. The wounded shooter behind her found his courage and swung his weapon up. She heard the shift of fabric, the scrape of a knee on marble, and she was already turning, dropping to one knee as his burst passed through the space her chest had occupied a heartbeat before. From that low kneeling posture, she fired once. It was enough. Then it was quiet, except for the wind howling through two shattered planes of glass and the small, hitching whimpers of the billionaire on the floor. Harper stayed still for a 3 count, ears straining beneath the ringing, scanning the ruined penthouse for a 6th man who wasn't there. Nothing moved. 5 bodies, no friendly casualties, principle intact, and, from the sound of it, thoroughly hysterical. She rose, ejected her spent magazine, seated a fresh one with a click that echoed in the sudden silence, and only then turned her attention to the man she was being paid an obscene amount of money to keep alive. Her first thought, uncharitable and immediate, was that he was enormous. Even folded and cowering, Dante Corvain was clearly a giant of a man, 6.5 feet of him, stuffed into a suit that had cost more than most cars, shoulders like a doorframe, hands big enough to palm a dinner plate. Her second thought was that a body like that was wasted on someone so useless. He was staring at her with wide, wet eyes over trembling fingers, his handsome face slack with terror, and she felt the familiar low burn of professional contempt. Dante, for his part, was having the single most disorienting experience of his adult life. He had smelled her the instant she came through the ceiling, under the cordite and the ozone and the copper tang of blood, a scent that hit the sleeping thing at the base of his spine and dragged it roaring into daylight. Fated mate. The words landed in his skull with the weight of a struck bell, undeniable, absolute. 32 years, an entire underground empire built and held and defended. Countless women who had thrown themselves at the golden Corvain heir, and none of them had ever made his instincts stand up and howl. This one had done it while covered in someone else's blood, holding a gun, not even looking at him. Every cell in his body wanted to rise to his full height, let the crushing weight of his true aura fill the room, and gather her against his chest. It was the hardest thing he had done in years to keep himself small, because he understood, in the same instant he understood what she was to him, exactly how this would go if he showed her the truth. She was the most lethal protection agent in Abyss City, coldly independent, contractually his, for exactly as long as the danger lasted. The moment she learned her client was the undefeated Alpha King, who could have flattened all 5 of those gunmen with his bare hands, she would file the assignment as a fraud, invoice him for the skylight, and be gone by morning. He would have to court her from across a city that both feared him and hunted him, on her terms, at her convenience. Or he could be exactly the pathetic, needy, trembling man the world already believed him to be. And she would have to stay. The decision took him less than a second. He let his lower lip wobble. "You," he breathed, and let his voice climb into a register of pure, quivering awe. "You're an angel. You fell out of the sky. Are you real? Am I dead? Did I die and you're the one who comes to collect handsome dead billionaires?" Harper stared at him. "Mr. Corvain," she said flatly. Her voice was low, even, and carried no warmth whatsoever. "My name is Harper Vale. Vanguard Security Solutions assigned me to your protective detail as of this morning. I'll be your lead executive protection agent going forward." "My bodyguard," Dante whispered, as though she had told him she was the reincarnation of a saint. He unfolded himself upward, and even his careful hunching couldn't fully hide the sheer size of him. But he made his movements clumsy, uncertain, the movements of a large man who had never once had to fight for anything. "Vanguard sent me a bodyguard, and she came down through the ceiling like divine retribution. I'm going to send them a fruit basket. I'm going to buy them. I'm going to buy the whole company and rename it after you." "That won't be necessary." Harper's eyes were already moving past him, cataloging the 2 blown-out walls, the wind, the exposure. Standard practice would be immediate relocation. But she filed that thought and returned to the client. because he had begun to breathe very fast, one giant hand pressed flat against his sternum. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't breathe. Miss Vale. Harper. I can't. This keeps happening. They keep coming. Do you know how many times this is? 4. 4 times this year. My hands won't stop shaking. Look at them. Look." He held them out. They were, in fact, shaking, which cost him some effort and no small amount of pride to produce on command. Harper looked at the trembling hands of a man who could clearly have snapped any of the dead assassins in half, and privately concluded that the ultra-wealthy were simply a different and lesser species. "You're in shock, Mr. Corvain. That's normal. I need to move you to a secure location now. Can you walk?" "Only if you're touching me." The words came out in a rush, and he seized on the idea with the desperation of a drowning man, because it was, in fact, the entire plan. "I have severe trauma. Severe. My physician will confirm it. I have documents. I have a whole folder. The panic attacks, the night terrors, the episodes. I cannot be alone. I physically cannot. If you leave my side, I will simply die of fear, and then Vanguard will have failed the contract, and I'll be dead, and it will be very awkward for everyone." Harper's jaw tightened by perhaps a millimeter. "My protocol is a rotating team with defined perimeters. You won't be alone. There will always be an agent within." "No." Dante's voice cracked on the word, and he let real force leak into it for just a moment before smothering it back into helplessness. "Not a team. Not strangers. You. Only you. You're the one who came out of the sky. You're the only one my nervous system trusts now. It's a documented phenomenon, ask anyone. 24 hours a day. You share my suite. You never leave my side. Not for meetings, not for meals, not while I sleep. Close proximity protection. That's the industry term, isn't it? I read about it. I want the most expensive, the most extreme, the closest possible protection that money can buy, and I want it wearing exactly the suit you're wearing right now." Harper regarded him for a long, cold moment. Sharing a principal's private suite was not unheard of for the highest threat contracts, and the man was, technically, a client currently standing in a penthouse full of professional killers who had come specifically for him. The threat was real. The paranoia, for once, was justified. She could refuse and hand the contract back, or she could take the outrageous fee that a demand like this would generate and babysit the neediest billionaire in Abyss City for as long as the money held. She holstered her weapon. "Fine," she said. 24-hour close protection. My rules, my perimeter, my call on movement. You do exactly what I say, when I say it, without argument. Are we clear, Mr. Corvain?" "Crystal," Dante said meekly, and lowered his eyes so she wouldn't see them shine. Behind the trembling and the tears and the flawless performance of a broken, harmless man, the Alpha King of Abyss City watched his fated mate turn away to sweep the room, and smiled the smallest, most private smile in the world. She thought she had just accepted a job. She had walked straight into his trap, and she was going to be very, very annoyed when she found out. The secure location Harper chose lasted exactly 3 days before Dante declared he would perish from confinement, and so on the 4th night, she found herself standing at the edge of a private balcony inside the Velvet Abyss, the most exclusive underground club in the city, watching her principal drape himself across a curved leather booth like a man who had never known a moment of fear in his life. She hadn't wanted to come. Every instinct she had screamed against it. An underground venue meant controlled access, yes, but it also meant crowds, darkness, alcohol, and 100 faces she couldn't vet. She had argued. Dante had produced tears, a rambling speech about how being trapped in his own suite was triggering his documented claustrophobia, and a promise that he would stay in the roped-off private section the entire time. She had relented because the alternative was listening to him hyperventilate for another hour, and because the truth was that a public appearance created a controllable kill box far easier to manage than an ambush of their choosing. So here she stood, back to the wall, eyes moving in slow, measured sweeps across the throbbing sea of bodies below, a champagne flute untouched on the table beside her that she had accepted only so her hands would look occupied. Dante sipped from his own glass and smiled at nothing. To the club, to the fawning attendants and the beautiful people who kept drifting toward the velvet rope, hoping to be noticed, he was exactly the golden prince they expected. Loose-limbed, laughing, carelessly generous, ordering bottles that cost more than a car and waving away the change. He looked like a man made entirely of good fortune and no consequences. He played it flawlessly, and only Harper, standing close enough to catch it, might have noticed that the laughter never once reached his eyes. Because his eyes were on her. They tracked her constantly, dark and slow and heavy-lidded, moving over the sharp black line of her tactical suit where it followed the curve of her hip, over the strong line of her shoulders, the sleek fall of her short black hair, the cold set of her mouth. He watched the way she stood, weight-balanced, ready, the way her gray-green gaze quartered the room without ever seeming to settle. He watched her the way a starving man watches a feast through glass, and he made certain that every time she glanced his way, he had rearranged his face back into the vacant, cheerful mask of a bored billionaire, admiring his own reflection in the champagne. She caught him looking twice. Both times she assumed the spoiled fool was ogling her, and both times she filed it under the long, tedious list of client behaviors she was paid to tolerate. He was insufferable. That was Harper's clinical assessment after 4 days. He talked without pause. He required constant reassurance. He had followed her to the bathroom door on the first night and stood outside it narrating his anxiety until she came out. He slept, or claimed to, only if she remained in the adjoining room with the connecting door open. He was, by every measure she had, the single most exhausting principal of her career, and he was paying enough to make the exhaustion worth it 3 times over. She reminded herself of the number every time she wanted to throttle him. Below them, the music swelled, and something shifted in the pattern of the crowd. Harper felt it before she saw it, a ripple of wrongness in the flow of bodies near the lower bar, the particular compression of people pulling back from a center point. Then voices, raised and ugly, cutting under the bass. A shove. A glass shattering. 2 men squaring off, then 4. Then the fast, ugly bloom of a brawl spreading outward as friends piled in, and strangers got caught in the swing of it. Bouncers were already converging, dark shapes muscling through the press. It was nothing. A drunken scuffle 40 feet away and 1 level down, contained, irrelevant to her principal's safety. She registered all of that in under a second and had already begun to relax when 240 pounds of terrified billionaire slammed into her from behind. "Oh, God!" Dante gasped, and his massive arms came around her waist, and he folded his enormous frame down and in against her back as though trying to fit the entirety of himself behind the shield of her body. "Oh, God, they're here. They found me. They're going to. Mr. Corvain!" Harper's voice was flat steel. "It's a bar fight. Let go." He did not let go. If anything, the arms tightened, and she felt his face press into the curve where her neck met her shoulder, felt the heat of his breath against her skin, ragged and fast. I can't! Don't make me look! Just get me out! Please, please get me out of here!" For half a heartbeat, Harper stood rigid inside the cage of his arms, and something in the back of her mind snagged on an inconsistency she couldn't yet name. His grip. Panicking man clutched at things blindly, clumsily, all flailing desperation. Dante's arms had come around her with a precision that placed them exactly where they needed to be to keep his center of mass behind hers, low, balanced, out of her line of fire. It was the hold of someone who knew how bodies moved in violence. She didn't have time to examine it. Protocol overrode analysis. If the principal believed he was in danger and would not be reasoned with, she extracted the principal. "We're moving," she said. "Stay behind me. Match my pace." She peeled his arms off her waist and noted, distantly, that they came away only because he allowed it. That for a fraction of a second the muscle beneath her hands had felt less like a soft rich man's flesh and more like warm carved stone. And she took his wrist and pulled him off the balcony toward the service corridor at the rear. It was the correct exit. Away from the crowd, away from the fight, toward the private egress she had mapped the moment they arrived, because she mapped every exit of every room she ever entered. The corridor was narrow and dim, lit only by the low red glow of emergency strips along the floor, the bass reduced to a muffled heartbeat through the walls. Harper had one hand on her holstered weapon and one still gripping Dante's wrist, hauling his enormous frame along behind her, when her ear caught it. A footstep in the corridor ahead that did not belong. The wrong weight, the wrong rhythm. A man moving with purpose toward them from the far end. Threat. Her body made the decision before her mind finished forming it. She spun, planted both hands flat against Dante's chest, and drove him sideways and back into the wall, putting her own body between him and the corridor, shielding, clearing her draw. It was a move she had performed 1,000 times. It was reflex, pure and clean. She got him against the wall. And then the world went strange. Because Dante did not stagger back like a man being shoved. He moved with her, into the wall, absorbing the force and redirecting it, his enormous frame settling into the corner exactly as though he had chosen the position himself. Exactly as though the two of them had rehearsed this 100 times, and his job was to end up pinned, so that hers could be to pin him. His body under her hands was not soft. It was not the yielding bulk of a pampered heir. It was a wall of dense muscle, hard as forged plate, and it had folded into her shielding stance with a fluid, trained economy that mirrored her own movement. So perfectly it was, as if he had read her intention out of the air a half-second before she committed to it. Harper froze. She was pressed full length against him now, pinning him to the wall with her forearm across his chest, her hip against his, her face inches below his in the red dark. She could feel his heart under her arm, and it was not hammering with terror. It was slow, deep, steady in a way that no panicking man's heart had any right to be. And his breathing, when it came, was not the shallow gasp of fear. It was heavy and low and rough at the edges with something else entirely, something that raised the fine hairs along her arms before she had consciously named it. The footstep in the corridor resolved into a club employee carrying a case of bottles, who took one look at the two of them and hurried past with his eyes down. Not a threat. There had never been a threat. Harper knew she should step back. Every professional protocol told her to reestablish distance, sweep the corridor, complete the extraction. She did not step back. She was held in place by the anomaly, by the impossible catalog of things her body was reporting that did not fit the man she was supposed to be guarding. The steel under her hands, the perfect mirror of her movement, the heartbeat that belonged to a predator at rest. And now his scent, close and warm and dizzying in the confined dark, something clean and dark and utterly unlike the expensive cologne she'd expected. Something that reached past her training and pulled at a part of her she kept locked and did not acknowledge. Then, Dante turned his head, and his lips brushed the shell of her ear. "There. You caught me," he murmured, and his voice in that instant was not the wavering, panicked whine of the trembling playboy. It had dropped an octave, gone quiet and dark and intimate, a low rasp that vibrated through the tiny space between them and rolled straight down her spine like cold water and fire braided together. "You always do." A shiver moved through her. She felt it happen and could not stop it. A full traitorous ripple from the nape of her neck to the base of her back. And she hated it. Hated that her body had answered him before her discipline could slam the door. Her gray-green eyes snapped up to his in the red gloom, searching, and for one suspended instant she saw it. Behind the vacant party prince mask, down in the dark of his gaze, Something vast and ancient and knowing looked back at her. Something that was not afraid of anything in this world and never had been. Then he blinked, and it was gone, and his face crumpled back into helpless gratitude, his lower lip trembling right on cue. "You saved me again," he whispered shakily, the terrified air reassembled in the space of a breath. "I don't know what I'd do. I'd be dead a dozen times over. Oh God, my heart. Feel how my heart is racing." His heart was not racing. Her arm was still across his chest, and she could feel that it was slow and even and calm. Harper stepped back. She did it with rigid control, restoring the professional distance, dropping her hands, sweeping the empty corridor with a gaze that had gone flat and hard as ice to cover the fact that beneath the ice her mind had begun, very quietly, to race. "You're safe," she said, and her voice betrayed nothing. "The situation was contained. It was a bar fight. We're leaving through the rear." "Yes," Dante breathed, all wide eyes and gratitude, gazing down at her from his towering height with an expression of pure worshipful helplessness. "Whatever you say. You're in charge. You're always in charge." She turned and led him down the red-lit corridor toward the exit, and she did not look back at him. Because if she looked back at him, she would have to reckon with the collection of impossible facts she had just gathered, and she was not ready to do that yet. A clumsy man did not move like a fighter. A terrified heart did not beat that slow. A soft playboy was not built beneath his tailored suit like something forged for war. And no client in her career had ever, in the middle of a panic attack, mirrored her tactical footwork with the seamless precision of a partner who had been trained in the exact same brutal discipline she had. She filed each anomaly away, cold and precise, in the part of her mind that never let anything go. And behind her, following meekly with his shoulders hunched and his enormous hands wringing, the Alpha King of Abyss City permitted himself, for exactly 1 second, to remember the feeling of her body pinning his against the wall, and to look forward, with the patience of a creature that had waited 32 years, to the moment she finally understood. The intelligence had been clean. A quiet meeting with a shipping executive at the old Dockside 9-yard, a routine contract matter that Dante had insisted on attending in person, and Harper had swept the site twice and hated every meter of it. Too open. Too many sightlines. Rows of rusting steel containers, stacked 4 high in the dark like the ruins of some drowned city. Cranes looming skeletal against a starless sky. The black water of the harbor lapping somewhere beyond the chain fence. She had told him it was a poor location. He had trembled and wrung his hands and said the executive refused to meet anywhere else. And she had relented for the 3rd time in a week, and standing now in the sodium orange gloom between 2 towering stacks of steel, she understood that she had made a mistake. The first rocket-propelled round took out the sedan they'd arrived in. The night went white and then roaring red, the vehicle lifting and folding in a bloom of flame that threw both of them sideways. And before the wreckage had finished settling the muzzle, flashes opened up from 3 directions at once. Not 5 men this time. Not a squad. Dozens. Harper hit the ground rolling, dragging Dante down by his lapel, and her mind performed its cold arithmetic in the space between heartbeats. Mercenaries, heavily armed, coordinated, dug into elevated positions across the container stacks, kill zone pre-registered, all exits covered. This was not an assassination attempt. This was a war party sent to erase a man from the earth, and she had walked her principal into the center of it. "Move," she snarled, and she meant it as a command that would tolerate no tears. For once he obeyed. She got a hand fisted in his jacket and hauled his enormous frame into the narrow canyon between 2 container stacks as rounds sparked and screamed off the steel where they'd been. And she returned fire on instinct, 2-handed, dropping the nearest silhouette off its perch with a controlled pair before she'd even fully found cover. She moved him the way she'd move any principal through a hot zone, her body a constant shield between him and the greatest density of fire, sacrificing her own exposure for his, because that was the job, and the job was the only thing left when the world turned to noise and fire. There. An open container at the end of the row, its far end intact, 3 steel walls that would stop rifle rounds. Not a way out, but a box that would keep him alive for the length of her final stand. "In," she barked, and shoved him toward it with everything she had. He resisted. For just an instant, one strange instant where 240 pounds of him did not move under a shove that should have staggered him, and then he let himself be driven, folding down and back into the shelter of the steel box, and she put her own body across the opening and fought. She fought like something that had decided it was already dead, and had chosen only how many it would take along. Her pistol ran dry, and she stripped a compact rifle off the first mercenary who tried to rush the container mouth, killing him with his own weapon before he cleared the corner, and she used its rounds with the miserly precision of someone counting every one. She dropped 2 more advancing along the left flank. She pivoted, took a man off the top of the stack, dropped back before the return fire chewed the steel where her head had been. Muzzle flashes strobed the dark from every angle. There were too many. She had always known, in the cold ledger she kept, that a number existed which she could not overcome, and tonight the enemy had brought it. A round found her. It came from her high right, from a shooter she hadn't cleared, and it tore a burning line across the meat of her left shoulder, spinning her half around and slamming her into the container's steel lip. The pain arrived a beat late, white-hot, and enormous, and she felt the wet heat spread instantly beneath her tactical jacket, felt it soak through the white undershirt she wore against her skin, blood spilling bright and fast down her arm and across her chest. Her left hand went numb. The rifle sagged. Harper set her jaw, braced her back against the steel, and did the arithmetic one final time. Ammunition, low. Left arm, failing. Enemy, uncounted and closing. Extraction, impossible. There would be no walking out of Dockside 9, so she would stand in the mouth of this container, and she would keep the fire off her principal for as long as her body held, and when it stopped holding, she would make them pay in the only currency she'd ever trusted. She raised the rifle in her good hand, breathed out slow, and prepared to die well. Behind her, inside the steel box, something changed. She felt it before she understood it, the way she'd felt the wrongness in the club, the way animals feel a pressure drop before a storm. The air in the container went dense, cold. The temperature of the dark itself seemed to fall, and a sensation crawled up the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the firefight, a primal, full-body warning that told every cell in her to be still, to be small, that something vast had just woken at her back. The scent of her blood had reached him. Inside the container, Dante Corvain went very quiet, and then he stopped pretending. It happened the way a landslide happens. No gradual thing, but a single catastrophic release of everything that had been held. The trembling stopped. The hunched, apologetic curve of his enormous shoulders unfolded and unfolded, and kept unfolding until he stood at his full towering height in the dark, and the helpless air was simply gone, sloughed off like a discarded skin. What straightened up in his place was something the underworld of Abyss City whispered about in the dark and prayed never to meet. The Alpha King. The undefeated one. And his mate's blood was in the air. He stepped out of the container. Harper felt him pass her, felt the sheer displacement of him move through the container mouth, and she turned her head, and what she saw stopped the breath in her throat. Dante walked out into the killing ground of Dockside 9, into the crossfire of a dozen automatic weapons, upright, unhurried, unafraid, and his eyes were glowing. A low, molten, lethal gold burned in them through the dark, and his handsome face had gone utterly still, wiped clean of every trace of the laughing fool, remade into a mask of absolute dominant authority that was somehow more terrifying than any rage could have been. He was calm. That was the worst of it. He walked into gunfire the way a man walks into his own home. And the mercenary's rounds, she saw it. She saw it and could not believe it. Either missed him or seemed to matter to him not at all. Then he moved, and the world could not keep up with him. She lost him. Her eyes, trained to track the fastest human movement, simply lost him between one blink and the next. He crossed 30 feet of open ground faster than her mind could follow, and the first mercenary's rifle was in his hand and then in pieces. The barrel bent into a useless right angle by fingers that closed on tempered steel like it was clay. And the man who'd held it was airborne, hurled into the container stack with a force that folded him against the corrugated metal and dropped him limp. Dante was already elsewhere. He flowed through the kill zone like dark water, finding every low place. And everywhere he passed, men fell. He fought without a weapon, and he did not need one. Harper watched, pinned in place by shock and blood loss, as her useless client took a squad of hardened mercenaries apart with his bare hands. A man rushed him, and Dante caught the descending rifle stock in one palm, stopped it dead, and drove the heel of his other hand into the man's chest so that he flew backward off his feet and did not rise. Two came at him together, from opposite sides, and he simply was not between them when they arrived, moving with a speed that turned their coordination into collision, and then his hands closed on the back of each neck and brought their skulls together with a crack that echoed across the yard. Bones broke under him, not the messy chaos of a brawl, but the surgical, absolute efficiency of a predator that knew precisely how much force ended a human being and applied exactly that and no more. And through all of it, she realized dimly, he was working. There was a pattern to his devastation, a geometry. He was not simply killing. He was killing the shooters whose angles led back to her, first and fastest. Every time a muzzle swung toward the container where she slumped bleeding, that shooter died before the trigger finished traveling. He put his own vast body between her and every line of fire even as he moved, the same shielding instinct she had spent her life perfecting, done at a speed and scale that made her own skill look like a child's. He was ensuring, with a ferocity that raised the hair along her arms, that not one more round, not one more drop of blood would touch her. A mercenary on the high stack. The one who had shot her, she realized. The one whose round had spilled her blood into the air and triggered all of this. Swung his rifle down for another shot at the wounded woman in the container mouth. Dante's head turned. The glowing gold eyes found the shooter. And for one instant, something crossed the Alpha King's still face that was not calm at all. Something that came up from a place older than the man and colder than the harbor water. A pure and absolute promise. He crossed to the base of the stack and he went up it, straight up 4 containers of rusting steel, finding purchase where there was none, moving like gravity had lost its claim on him. And he reached the top, and he took the shooter, and Harper looked away. Because even she, who had counted her own kills without flinching for 11 years, understood that what happened at the top of that stack was not for watching. There was a sound. Then there was silence. And then the yard was quiet. And the only thing moving in it was the towering figure that dropped from the container stack and landed in a crouch on the concrete before her, and rose, and turned, and became, carefully, deliberately, as though remembering how, the man she thought she knew. But he wasn't hiding it now. The gold still burned low in his eyes as he crossed to her, and there was nothing helpless in the way he moved, nothing soft. He knelt in front of her, where she'd slid down the steel wall, and his enormous hands, the hands she had just watched break a squad of armed men, came to her wounded shoulder with a gentleness that made no sense against everything she had just witnessed. He peeled back the torn edge of her jacket and looked at the blood staining her white undershirt crimson, and a low sound came out of him, felt more than heard, a resonance that vibrated in her chest and raised every fine hair on her body. Harper stared up at him. Her cold, gray-green eyes, which had watched 100 violent things without changing, were wide now, stripped bare, filled with an absolute and breathtaking shock she could not command back into stillness. The clumsy playboy. The trembling coward who couldn't walk without holding her hand, who cried at bar fights, who needed the light on to sleep. She had shielded that man with her own body. She had prepared to die for that man. That man had never existed. You, she breathed, and her voice, so flat and even for 4 days, cracked straight down the middle. What are you? Dante looked at her with those slow-burning gold eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was the low, dark rasp she'd heard for one stolen second in the corridor of the Velvet Abyss. The true one. The one that rolled through her like fire and ice braided together. "I'm sorry you had to bleed before you saw me," he said quietly. His thumb brushed the edge of her wound, and his jaw tightened, and something lethal moved behind his eyes again at the sight of it. No one who spills your blood walks away. No one. Do you understand? Harper did not understand. Harper, for the first time in her adult life, understood nothing at all. She sat with her back against cold steel in a yard full of the dead, her blood cooling on her chest, and she looked up at the god of war kneeling over her with terrible tenderness, and every certainty she had ever built her life upon quietly came apart. The silence of Dockside 9 settled over the yard like a shroud, broken only by the guttering flames of the ruined sedan and the slow lap of harbor water against the rotting pilings. Harper sat with her back against cold steel, her blood cooling on the white of her undershirt, and watched the impossible man cross the concrete toward her. Every stride was unhurried, deliberate, the walk of something that owned the ground it moved across, and everything standing on it. The gold had banked low in his eyes, but it had not gone out, and it lit his face from within as he came, so that the handsome features she'd spent 4 days dismissing as soft now looked carved from something ancient and unyielding. Dante dropped to one knee before her. The motion should have looked like submission. It did not. It looked like a king choosing, for reasons of his own, to lower himself, and the choosing was its own kind of power. His enormous hands closed around her injured arm with a gentleness that made no sense against the carnage he had just wrought. He turned it toward the firelight, examining the raw furrow the bullet had torn across her shoulder, and that low sound rolled out of his chest again, felt more than heard, a resonance that vibrated in her sternum and raised the fine hairs along the back of her neck. "This detail is over," he said. His voice was the dark, commanding purr she had heard only in fragments until tonight, low and rich and absolute. "You will not stand between me and gunfire again. You will not bleed for me again. That was the last time, Harper. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Harper stared at him, and her professional mask, the flat, cold thing she had worn her whole adult life, cracked and would not reassemble. "You don't get to end my contract. That's not how." "I'm not ending your contract." His thumb traced the skin below the wound, careful, reverent, and his gold eyes rose to hers and held them. "I'm reversing it. For 4 days you protected me. Now it's my turn. From this moment forward, for the rest of your life, I protect you. That is the only arrangement I will accept." She had no answer for that. For the first time in 11 years, Harper Vale had no answer at all. He tore a strip from his own ruined jacket, bound her shoulder with a field dressing's practiced economy that only confirmed everything she already knew and could not yet accept, and then he lifted her. She, who had never been carried, who had dragged wounded men twice her size out of worse places than this, was gathered against his chest as though she weighed nothing, and she was too depleted and too stunned to fight it. She felt the steady, slow drum of his heart against her cheek, the same impossible calm she'd felt in the corridor of the Velvet Abyss, and somewhere between the shipping yard and the black car that materialized from the dark with silent armed men around it, she stopped trying to make the pieces fit and simply let the exhaustion take her. The syndicate headquarters was nothing like the glittering penthouse the world believed Dante Corvain inhabited. It rose from the industrial heart of Abyss City, a fortress of black stone and reinforced glass. Its corridors lined with men who lowered their eyes and pressed themselves to the walls as the Alpha King passed with his wounded agent in his arms. Harper, drifting in and out, cataloged it all with the part of her that never stopped working. The security was flawless. The deference was absolute. Whatever this man was, an entire hidden nation of the city's underworld bent its knee to him, and he had let her boss him through a bathroom door for 4 days without so much as a flicker. She woke hours later, patched and rested, in a room that was clearly his, and she found her tactical suit cleaned and pressed and waiting. She dressed. She checked the dressing on her shoulder with clinical detachment. And then she took a single sheet of paper from the desk, and she wrote, in her precise flat hand, a letter of resignation. She found him in the great office at the tower's summit, and this was the final confirmation, if she'd needed one. He sat behind a desk of black mahogany the size of a small boat, in a high-backed chair that was, unmistakably, a throne, and the men arranged around the room's edges watched him the way prey watches a predator that has not yet decided it is hungry. The laughing party prince was nowhere in this room. What sat in that chair was the undefeated ruler of everything that moved in the dark beneath Abyss City, and he watched her walk toward him with those slow gold eyes and a stillness that was worse than any threat. She stopped before the desk and set the letter down on the black wood between them. "My resignation," she said, and her voice was steel again, cold and even, whatever it had cost her to make it so. "Effective immediately. Vanguard will return your retainer, less expenses. The target is demonstrably capable of self-defense. My services are not required and, based on tonight, never were. This assignment was a fraud from the first hour, Mr. Corvain, and I don't work fraud." Dante looked at the letter. He did not pick it up. He looked at it the way a man looks at something faintly amusing, and then he reached out one enormous hand and, without breaking her gaze, tore it neatly in half. Then in half again. He let the pieces fall. "Rejected," he said. "It isn't a request. Neither is my answer." He rose. He came around the desk, and the room seemed to shrink as he unfolded to his full towering height, and the armed men found urgent reasons to study the floor. "You said it was a fraud. It wasn't. Every threat was real, Harper. Every gun, every round, every man who came for me in earnest, and any one of them would have put you in the ground given the chance. The only fraud was me. The trembling, the tears, the terror. That I confess to freely." She held her ground as he approached, because retreating was not in her, but her pulse had begun a traitorous climb she could not command down. "Why?" "Because of what you are to me." He stopped close, too close, and she took one step back before she caught herself, and another, until the cool, heavy mahogany of the office doors met her spine, and there was nowhere further to go. He set one massive forearm against the wood beside her head, and then the other, and his frame closed around her like a cage of muscle and heat, and she was surrounded suddenly by his scent, that clean, dark, impossible thing that reached past her discipline the way it had in the corridor. "I knew the first second you came through that skylight. Before you'd finished killing the men in my living room, I knew. You are my mate, Harper Vale. Fated, bone deep. The one my blood has been silent and waiting for since before you were born. I have crushed everything that ever stood against me, and I have never once wanted anything the way I wanted you the instant you dropped out of the sky covered in someone else's blood." Her breath had gone shallow. She hated that it had, and she could not stop it. "You played helpless. For 4 days. You made me carry you through doorways." "I played the fool," he agreed, and there was no shame in it, only a dark satisfaction. "Because the moment you learned what I was, you'd have handed back the contract and vanished into a city that would spend the rest of its life trying to kill you for having known me. So I made you a shield you couldn't put down. I made you believe I needed you. I kept you at my side 24 hours a day, in my rooms, close enough to smell, and I waited. I am, if nothing else, a patient man." His gold eyes dropped to her mouth, then rose again. "But I never once intended to let anyone hurt you to do it. Tonight the intelligence failed. Someone will answer for that, and the sight of your blood ended the pretending, because I discovered there is exactly one thing on this earth I will not permit, and it is you bleeding while I stand still." "This is insane," she said, but her voice had lost its edge, and they both heard it. "Perhaps." He reached into his jacket and drew out a single folded document, and he held it up between them where she could read it. Not a resignation. Not a contract of protection. A marriage certificate, drawn and ready, with his name already inscribed in bold black ink and a blank waiting for hers. "You said you don't work without a contract. Here is your final one. The only client you'll ever protect, and the only man who will ever protect you. Lifetime terms. No expiry clause. Sign it." Harper looked at the certificate. Then she looked at the man who filled her entire field of vision. The god of war who had knelt in the blood to bandage her arm with hands that could break steel. The ruler of the city's dark who had spent 4 days letting her order him around because he could not bear to let her walk away. And she understood, standing pinned against his office doors with her heart hammering and her cold, careful world in ruins around her, that the shock had burned away and left behind something she had not felt in 11 years, and had believed herself incapable of ever feeling again. She had spent her whole life alone, because she had never met anyone strong enough to stand beside her rather than behind her. She had made herself into a blade, because a blade needs no one. And here, impossibly, was her equal. Her opposite and her mirror. Darkness that matched her darkness exactly. Strength that did not diminish hers, but doubled it. "I don't lose fights," she said quietly. "And I don't lose arguments." "Then it's fortunate," Dante murmured, lowering his head until his mouth was a breath from hers, "that I'm not asking you to lose. I'm asking you to win with me." She kissed him. Or he kissed her. Neither of them could afterward have said which, only that the space between them vanished and the world caught fire. It was nothing gentle. It was two lethal creatures who had spent their lives holding back finally, for the first time, meeting someone they did not have to hold back from, and the kiss carried all of it, the violence and the hunger and the long ache of solitude. His hands left the doors and found her, one at the small of her back, and one cradling her jaw with a care that trembled against the raw power beneath it, and she fisted her good hand in his shirt and pulled him closer instead of pushing him away. And somewhere in the room, the armed men wisely and silently withdrew. When they finally broke apart, she was breathing hard, and so, for the first time she had ever witnessed, was he, the slow, calm heart gone wild against her palm at last. "The certificate," she said against his mouth. "You'll sign it?" "I'll sign it," Harper said. "But I read every clause first. And I set the security protocols for the wedding. All of them." Dante laughed, and it was nothing like the empty golden laugh of the party prince. It came from somewhere deep and real and free, and it was the most dangerous and beautiful sound she had ever heard. "My lethal wife," he said, and pressed his forehead to hers. "I have been waiting my whole life for you to say exactly that." In the quiet after, standing in the arms of the man the whole underworld feared, Harper Vale looked out through the tall black windows at the neon veins of Abyss City spread below, and she let herself understand the things she had spent 11 years refusing to learn. She had believed strength meant standing alone, that needing no one was the highest form of power, that the blade that touches nothing stays sharpest. She had been wrong. Standing alone was not strength. It was only isolation wearing strength's face. Real strength was this: finding the one person whose darkness fit against your own without either being dimmed, whose edges matched yours perfectly, who could stand at your shoulder in the gunfire and not need protecting, and not offer condescension, but simply be there, equal and lethal, and yours. She had spent her life being the sharpest blade in every room. Now, for the first time, she was half of something sharper than either of them could ever be alone. And as Dante's arms tightened around her, and the city glittered cold and vast beneath their tower, Harper, who had never in her life felt safe because she had never in her life met anyone she couldn't kill, felt something entirely new settle into the space beneath her ribs. It felt like coming home. If you enjoyed this action-packed, hidden identity romance audiobook, please hit the like button and subscribe for more epic stories.